The concept of gender dysphoria as a diagnosis has been both a boon and a problem for the trans community. On the one hand, it was meant to destigmatize transgender mental health, but on the other, trans medicalists and other people who don't necessarily understand the history of transgender diagnoses have been weaponizing that concept, insisting that the DSM-5's diagnosis of gender dysphoria means non-dysphoric trans people don't exist and therefore are not valid. In this video, I'm going to talk about what people get wrong about dysphoria, why you don't need dysphoria to be trans, and a little history about that. When I went on hormones, the diagnosis that I got from my therapist was gender identity disorder, or GID. Shortly after I got diagnosed, like literally months, if that, this diagnosis was changed to the much less stigmatizing gender dysphoria, which is the diagnosis that trans people will get today if they go the medical route of going on hormone replacement therapy or getting surgery. This was long enough ago that there are plenty of trans people today out there who just weren't around yet when it was still called GID, and some of them assume that this means that gender dysphoria is a direct synonym for transgender people in general. And that's used to bolster a claim that if you don't experience gender dysphoria, you're not really transgender, which is then used as an excuse to harass trans people who aren't dysphoric and exclude them from trans spaces. In this video, I'm going to talk about 2 reasons why that whole clusterfuck is nonsense, focusing on the facts about this situation. First, many trans people who say that they aren't dysphoric actually are dysphoric. They're merely mistaken as to what that term means. And second, the diagnosis of gender dysphoria is partially intended to validate the fact that not all trans people have gender dysphoria or need treatment. Many people who think they're not dysphoric actually are. First, I want to mention that there are some people out there who object to the term gender dysphoria because they object to medicalized terminology in general. And there's a big difference between intentionally objecting to having that terminology applied to you and merely being mistaken and assuming it doesn't. I'm talking about the latter case in this section, not the former. Gender dysphoria is defined on the American Psychiatric Association's website as a clinically significant distress or impairment related to a strong desire to be another gender than your assigned gender, which may include the desire to change primary or secondary sex characteristics. The may here is really important because many people talk about dysphoria as discomfort specifically with what your body looks like. But there's a whole cornucopia of ways your gender interacts with your daily life. What pronouns you want to be called have nothing to do with your appearance, but the deeply negative feeling a transgender person may get when being misgendered is still gender dysphoria, even if they are comfortable with their body and expression as it is. Gender dysphoria also doesn't only count when it's extreme. Like a lot of other mental health issues, like depression, having a milder version of it doesn't mean you don't have it. Somebody who has depression might need medication to manage it, or they might just need talk therapy, and there are even plenty of people who are able to cope with depression with no treatment at all. In the same way, somebody with gender dysphoria might need hormone replacement therapy, they might need top surgery, they might need bottom surgery, they might need more than one of those, or they might just need one. They might need only HRT, and a significant number just need to socially transition without any changes to their body whatsoever. And all of those are equally gender dysphoria. This does not mean that trans people without gender dysphoria don't exist, and I'll explain why in the next section. Just that for the vast majority of trans people, this is going to be a moot point. Folks like me who need hormone replacement therapy and multiple gender-affirming surgeries, we don't have a monopoly on what constitutes gender dysphoria. There's a lot of things that fall under that category. Some people consider themselves non-dysphoric because they prefer to call what they experience gender euphoria instead. I would personally argue that even if somebody's transition starts as gender euphoria, the drive to transition still qualifies as gender dysphoria. For instance, I'm really kind of on the fence about whether or not I would call my teen and childhood experiences dysphoria. I certainly behaved in ways that would have been red flags to like a transgender adult, but was I really uncomfortable with my assigned gender at the time? I don't really think so. The moment I decided to transition for real, it was because I was in college and I was drawing self-portraits in the lounge. I started drawing masculine features on them like facial hair and just thinking of myself looking like those portraits, and it gave me just an intense rush of joy. I decided to transition based on the joy that I felt at the idea of being male at that time. But that joy was also a catalyst. Stuff that I was pretty ambivalent about before became discomforting, and my needs changed. I also get the impression that some people try to play up that gender euphoria thing, because as a community we have kind of a cultural urge to downplay the negative mental health aspects of being transgender. But that's really just an impression. I don't live in their heads. You can absolutely call what you experience gender euphoria, but for the most part, trans people experience both gender dysphoria and gender euphoria at different times. But back to talking about trans exclusionists, people who try to gatekeep non-dysphoric trans people out of trans spaces and resources. There's a particular argument out there that some of these people make that is really garbage, which is that there's a significant number of people out there who don't have gender dysphoria and who are out there stealing resources, including medical treatments like HRT and surgery that should be going to us respectable dysphoric transsexuals. And that's wildly off base. Trans people who don't have gender dysphoria and have never had gender dysphoria simply do not go through the effort, time, and often money it requires to get their bodies permanently changed to differentiate it from their assigned sex. If they do that, they probably have gender dysphoria, regardless of what language they choose to use to describe that. Because of this, any examples out there of supposed non-dysphoric trans people harming dysphoric trans people by taking our resources are illusions based on faulty reasoning. When it comes to circumstances where transgender care really is limited by capacity, like say in the UK where there are extremely long wait lists for getting it, the problem isn't that suddenly people are seeking those services who don't really need it. It's that the people who need that care are suddenly more comfortable seeking it, and the number of providers hasn't increased enough to compensate for that. And with gender-affirming care being unnecessarily controversial, the cis people who are in power don't necessarily feel as obligated to fix that. So a lot of people who wind up getting called non-dysphoric trans people actually do have gender dysphoria by definition. Does this mean that all trans people must have dysphoria? The answer is absolutely not. Not only is it not, but the fact that it isn't is exactly why the diagnosis in the DSM is now called gender dysphoria and not gender identity disorder. Transgender is not synonymous with gender dysphoric. Like I already said, I was diagnosed with gender identity disorder when I went on hormones, and I got that diagnosis only a couple of months before the DSM-5 was published, updating that vernacular to gender dysphoria. Because of this timing, I do very clearly remember things like the news from that period of time, including a piece in The Advocate I'm going to link to in the description that quotes some people who were involved in that change. This paints a very different picture than you might get if you listen to trans-medicalist discourse, which sometimes likes using the diagnosis of gender dysphoria to gatekeep who can and can't call themselves members of the trans community. Just a couple of examples from that Advocate article. Jack Drescher, a member of the subcommittee who worked on that change, said the following: "We know there is a whole community of people out there who are not seeking medical attention and who live between the two binary categories. We wanted to send the message that the therapist's job isn't to pathologize." In the same article, Dana Beyer of the Washington Psychiatric Society was quoted as saying, "A right-winger can't go out and say all trans people are mentally ill because if you are not dysphoric, that can't be diagnosed from afar. It no longer matters what your body looks like, what you want to do with it. All of that is irrelevant as far as the APA goes." So the people who made this change were not making a statement that all transgender people must have gender dysphoria or they aren't valid trans people. They were literally saying the opposite, that transgender people without dysphoria do exist, and that they should not be pathologized or treated as mentally ill because of that. In a nutshell, gender identity disorder made the gender identities themselves into a psychiatric disorder, and transphobic bigots were actively using that diagnosis in order to say that we are all inherently mentally ill. Changing this diagnosis to gender dysphoria narrows it down so the only people who are considered to have a psychiatric disorder are the ones who are in clinically significant distress, and that the disorder is the distress, not the gender identity itself. This is also reflected in the American Psychiatric Association's literature on the topic. In their article about gender dysphoria, they start by defining trans people as people with gender identities that do not match our assigned sex. Then they say some people who are transgender will experience gender dysphoria. Some people. It specifically says some people. They're very clear here that transgender is not synonymous with gender dysphoric, and that is a very intentional distinction. People who use the diagnosis of gender dysphoria to gatekeep who can call themselves trans are bullshitting you. It's simply not true. The depth of transmedicalist logic. I wanted to end this video by talking just a bit about the history of this kind of rhetoric and what makes this whole situation kind of baffling for me, which is that not long ago, and definitely during the time I've been out as trans, the people who we now call transmedicalists were not calling themselves transgender at all. And for the most part, they were trying really hard to distance themselves from using that terminology. A lot of them referred to themselves as transsexual, and some of them used the term Harry Benjamin syndrome. But the last thing any of these people wanted to be called was transgender, because transgender was an umbrella term that included a hell of a lot of people that they didn't approve of. But the memory of the trans community is unfortunately kind of short and fragmented sometimes, so younger and more newly transitioning trans folks who weren't exposed to that transsexual versus transgender dichotomy or the HBS rhetoric of days gone by started trying to claim transgender for themselves and only themselves. This is a running theme among trans folks of a particular respectable sensibility. They're chasing whatever terminology they think will lend the most credibility by cis people's standards and distinguish them from trans people they don't like, that they don't think are respectable enough. Now that transgender as a word has some credibility, they're trying to claim that they're the only ones authorized to use that term. But while they certainly do have the right to call themselves transgender, they don't own it. It's not something that only applies to them. Finally, I wanted to mention that both in the past and today, this type of rhetoric never has really been about whether or not somebody actually experiences gender dysphoria, because what constitutes enough dysphoria or the right kind of dysphoria is a moving target that depends on what the individual doing the gatekeeping personally finds objectionable. There are people who believe this stuff but who are quite lenient with their definition of what dysphoria is. They're wrong, but they're lenient, and there are also people who won't accept people as properly trans enough unless we have genital dysphoria and are actively seeking surgery. Conversely, weirdly enough, there are also people who won't accept a lot of trans men as being dysphoric enough because they get bottom surgery and they believe toxic stereotypes about phalloplasty and think anybody who would settle for that must not want to be enough of a man. It's very weird. That's the point here. It's a moving target. When I was off of hormones for a few years, I met one guy who called me fake for being off of hormones, and then somebody else mentioned trans guys who go off of HRT to stop hair loss, and he said that that was different. Like, his standards for what makes a trans man valid were inconsistent because his real problem was me as an individual. The point is, transmedicalist gatekeeping rhetoric is always changing because it doesn't make any coherent sense. And it's not based on actual up-to-date psychological literature at all, just the insecurities and biases of individual gatekeepers. Please do not fall into that trap. It's all nonsense, and it does nothing to help dysphoric trans people at great expense to everybody else. Anyway, with all of that said, happy trails, and I will see you next time.